Hello and welcome to the first Balanced Politics debate. I'm your host, Winter Nascent Messiah, and tonight we'll discuss the merits of capitalism versus a more regulated economy. Our contenders for tonight are Swishy and Browse. As you might maybe notice later on, we are all quite new to this, but I'm convinced we'll all intend more to make up for it through sheer enthusiasm. All that being said, let us now have the contestant introduce himself before we begin with our first question. Your position, which side of the issue you're going to represent?
Okay, basically, I hold the position that a market can never be free. A free market is like an uncapped pipe dream. True freedom is just anarchy. Anarchy is a vacuum of power and order, and those vacuums get filled.
All right, Bravos?
I would say that my statement, I advocate for a freer market, while Swishy is correct in saying that an absolutely true free market has not existed, and I don't think we ever can get to it in a pragmatic manner. But we have seen patterns in history, especially I would point to America and Great Britain, that the freer the market and the more advantages you give people to choose voluntarily, the greater wealth and prosperity that we'll have. And also the standard of life, the standard quality of life will also increase.
Then for my first question, I'd immediately go to you. Infrastructure. We all know the roads, etc., etc. How would in your society infrastructure be funded? How would it be maintained? How would it evolve, expand, etc., etc.?
Well, right now, how we do things is the government will pay a contractor, and the contract will bid for a specific job. And so the roads essentially are already taken care of by private interests. So, I mean, I would find a way in which to voluntarily congregate together and have private companies do that. But I wouldn't say that I do have a huge problem with the government organizing that as it is right now.
Swishy?
Okay, I have two ways in which I would pay for the infrastructure. The first way being taxes, of course. The second way I think should be social dividends. I think that the state should run some of the means of production. Like if you look at Norway, the state owns the oil company. They own Equinor, and it means you don't have to take as much taxes. Capitalists are always complaining that they take taxes from the hardworking people to pay for the lazy people. Well, social dividends is a way that you don't have to deal with it.
So you would say that the state has to create money rather than just take money?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. What do you say, Bravo? Is that something that you can see as working or something that you see as inherently unjust or not functional?
Well, I would see the state as creating money, as in providing more money in excess. So I would not be in the favor of any kind of inflationary methods to pay for anything. If people want to contribute to that through taxes, I think that system has worked to a great extent already in America today. But idealistically, I would like to see the roads being taken care of in a more private manner. I mean, we already do have some private roads with tolls, but of course, there is the question of whether or not the government at its current state would ever allow that. And I don't think it would. So I don't see the infrastructure as being a huge problem. What I am focusing more on is an excess in regulation, not in its basic stable form.
Okay. One thing I'd like to return back to.
Please.
You said you don't want the government increasing inflation by creating wealth. I don't mean creating wealth by printing money. I mean actually producing income, being profitable. The second thing, if you want to talk about inflation, you give the US as an example of a successful capitalist state. I mean, they're printing $1 trillion every single year and boosting up the stock market and the bonds to the point where the bubble's going to pop sooner or later. and the American dollar will probably end up collapsing. I don't think it's a good example of a capitalist state.
No, I agree with you that the current system is not a good example of capitalism. What I would point towards is what I would like is to have the Federal Reserve abolished and have private banks take care of the money supply system. But I would point to, though, even though we do have a Federal Reserve banking system that controls the supply of money and the interest rates, there were times, during the 1900s, 1920s, then after the Great Depression, say in the 1950s, where we did see an increasing standard of living. The quality of life went up for a lot of Americans, and America became the richest country in the whole entire world. So I would not look at the state of America as it is right now as the ideal. But as I said in my opening statement, I would look at patterns in history that we have where humanity has gleaned the most from the policies at that time.
Right. I see that as a transitional stage. What you're saying is you don't want the state, the Federal Reserve, to have this power. You want to see it in the hands of private banks. The issue I see with that is 5 private banks who pretty much control the Federal Reserve. You're talking about J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs. These are the people who essentially get into every single position at the Federal Reserve, who get into every single position in these offices. I think that when you say that the private sector should handle it, the private sector aren't going to do a better job. The private sector are doing a terrible job.
Well, how I would respond to that is to say that the government has opened itself up. Like, for instance, the Federal Reserve was created in a response to the public complaining about Wall Street bankers, essentially. And in response to that, they did create the Federal Reserve banking system. And originally, it was supposed to be 12 different banks that operated autonomously, but still sort of answered to one federal bank, I believe, when I was studying this. But eventually, since the Federal Reserve, at the end of the day, was able to control monetary policy and interest rates, it was able to corner banks into basically falling in line by offering credit and then suddenly drying up the supply of money, giving them loans, and then drying up the supply of money so that they cannot pay those loans back. And so country banks also had to adopt the Federal Reserve model. And I would say, I think we're blaming private interests for taking advantage of a system that has made itself essentially a prostitute to the highest bidder.
Right, I agree. I don't think I'm not asserting any kind of moral blame towards these companies. They do what they're intended to do. They're intended to make profit, and then under this system, making profit is the most important thing. And I think that's the system that we have to change rather than push blame onto these companies. I think what you're saying is, there was 12 systems initially. People from these banks got into the positions at the Federal Reserve, end up pushing the other banks out to the point where they had to buy them out, and now there's 5 banks. So if we want to go to a system where they don't have as much influence, then I would be for that. But you're pushing for a system where they have more influence.
No, I'm not, and I'll explain to you why I say that. I advocate for the government to regulate, definitely, but regulate itself. Pass laws that would not open itself up to lobbying or to seeding private interests from internationalist bankers, as you mentioned. I would have the government strictly and very, very, very seriously take into consideration the fact that it cannot allow any kind of outside interest, any kind of third party to influence its politics or its policies. So instead of regulating the free market, which is, again, like it's by and for profit, I would not allow the government to open itself up, again, like I said, like a prostitute.
Okay, so how do you at all stop that? If you have a system where the main directive of these organizations, of these banks, of these international capitalists is to make more profit, and the best way for them to make more profit is to influence the government, then how do you expect them not to influence the government? My suggestion would be to change
make lobbying
the
illegal.
system. Well, how does that stop some ex-JP Morgan CEO becoming the head of the Federal Reserve?
because you wouldn't allow a Federal Reserve System to be established in the first place. You would not allow the government to create a central banking system, because, like I said, these excess regulatory bodies, these regulations that are created to allow the government to operate outside of its intended purposes by the founding fathers, would make it so that these bodies could not be created and that these people couldn't have influence.
Well, do you not agree that we need some of these bodies? Like, we need people to make regulations on the economic sector. Like, if we didn't have any regulations in the banking sector, do you not think it would be worse off?
Actually, that's that's a very interesting point where I'd like to connect. In general, what would you say caused the 2008 banking crisis? What were the root causes? Who was responsible, and how could it be prevented from happening again? Do you have any kind of input on that?
Sure. One of the big reasons for why there was a recession or there was a collapse is because the government was forcing banks to give loans to people that they knew could not pay that loan back. And then also, they're giving out mortgages as well, different kinds of loans to people who could not pay them back. Also, you can also throw in hyperinflation in there, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, hyperinflation is going to drive up the cost of goods while depreciating the value of wages. Yeah, that's what I would say.
I completely agree. I don't think we disagree on what happened. I think we disagree on. I don't think we disagree on why it happened. Rather, who was responsible.
Exactly. That's what I'm asking.
Right. I agree on hyperinflation. I agree that the government, the Federal Reserve, forced these banks to give out loans to people who couldn't afford it. But my problem is that the people who were in the government institutions were from these private banks and influenced the government in that way. And I don't think if you take away regulations and allow these people to do whatever they want, like, that's what they want you to do that. Like, that's not a situation that's going to help you. I think you're much better off setting regulations that stop them being able to do this, rather than just saying, oh, damn it, they've got control, let's just scrap the whole thing. Why not place restrictions on monopolization? Why not place restrictions on who you can loan to? Why not place restrictions on how you can manipulate loans, bonds, rather than letting them have complete control and they can hold your country hostage? They can create hyperinflation, they can burst the bubble, they can cause recessions, they can influence economic global politics at a grand scale. And these people don't just own banks in the United States. These people own banks all over the world.
Yeah, but I would respond to that. You remember you were saying, why don't we put a regulation on banks not to give loans to certain people? Why don't we give the government this power to regulate? And essentially, all across the Western world, we have these central banks now. We have international bankers with their hands in everything. And it wasn't for lack of trying that these governments try to regulate and try to keep these sort of things happening. I mean, for instance, a good example would be Standard Oil. President Roosevelt, he established antitrust laws. I mean, there was always a great paranoia from the people about some kind of monetary body taking power. For instance, like in the beginning of America, when we had the Articles of Confederation, Morris was schooling Alexander Hamilton to implement mercantilism with the central bank as well. This is something we are always fighting, but the one constant I see in all of this is a government body opening itself up to regulating the economy, eventually, like in vast swaths, controlling it, manipulating it to such an extent where private bankers, like international bankers, like you're talking about, people who do not have good interests for the nation's domestic population, can use that power to influence and get inside the government. I would rather just have the government have no power to regulate, and then we wouldn't have these problems.
Okay, so you think in a system where these people are allowed to do whatever they want, no regulation, that this is gonna somehow control them? I think this comes from the sort of ANCAP NAP idea of like you can have an absence of power. Like you can't have an absence of power. If in a situation where there's no power, power will rise. Okay, these banks will fill that vacuum of power themselves. And you might not like the state. The state might not be perfect. There might be issues with it. But if you don't give the state the power, someone else will come in and take that power. You can't have a system where no one holds the power over the economic feature of the country.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about power vacuums, and you're talking about you're talking about eventually taking power, eventually doing something. These don't seem like specifics to me. They just seem a bit like fear mongering, because the fact is that these entities were not able to take control until the government escalated its power and made itself open.
I agree. Like, you live in a crony capitalist country. I don't think it's a good system. My problem is I don't advocate for every regulation that America has put in place. I'm not a full-on Marxist. I don't advocate for every regulation under the sun. I think there are some regulations.
I think we don't agree. Yeah, sorry, I don't think we agree, because you're blaming the private industry. Like, I mean, not even the banks. We don't have to focus on the banks, but just industrialists, people that operate grocery stores. You know, all these different branches of the market. You're essentially saying that without the government with a heavy hand regulating them, they're going to somehow rise in power and try to control the people. But I have just told you that the things that you're worried about, these private bankers, they were not able to do anything until the government escalated in power and opened itself up to being manipulated.
I think there's a misunderstanding. I'm not blaming the companies. I think they're responsible, but the blame lies on the system, the capitalist system. I think that when you create a system where the prime motive is to create profit, regardless of the cost, you're going to have this situation. You're opening yourself up to attack. Whether or not the people who are going to attack you are responsible is irrelevant. It will happen. That's what's important. Now, you have to try and change the rules of the game so that it can't happen. If you have these systems where you can have these entities that gain this immense wealth and power, and they're going to gain an influence over the state. And when they gain an influence over the state, they're going to change the laws and change the regulations, which means they're going to gain more power and incorporate different laws that increase the gap of wealth inequality. And when they increase the gap of wealth
historically, I would just say that's not accurate.
When people increase the gap of wealth inequality, the people who are affected by that, people at the bottom, they're not going to have any loyalty to the nation, because the nation is not helping them. The nation is not putting food on their table. And when they don't have any loyalty to the nation, the country collapses. There's no social cohesion. So I think when you have this pure capitalist system where there's free markets, laissez-faire, all you're doing is saying that you give up on a state. Like, you give up on the state having that monopoly on power.
Speaking of the monopoly on power, how do you both feel about fiat currency? Swishy, you start. How do you feel about fiat currency?
What do you mean by that? Like the global currency of the dollar?
Yes, and just unbacked currency, free floating currency, the currency whose value is essentially determined by market forces rather than being backed by anything.
Personally, I don't have an issue with it. I'm not an economist. I don't know to 100% that that's not a bad thing, but I don't see an issue with it. Like, money is just a unit of measurement to me. Like, I don't think it needs to have a backing like gold or diamonds.
Yeah, I've heard the definition that it's essentially a way of measuring time spent, in essence. It was maybe not per se correct, but quite interesting to hear. Bravos, what's your take on that?
Sure. I'd like to answer this and then respond to what Swishy had said beforehand, but I think that fiat currency is an absolutely atrocious thing to do to your people, because essentially what politicians are able to do is they're able to give the populace goods in the here and now, but while sending your children basically into slavery in the future. I mean, for instance, only in World War I, 70% of the cost of the war was paid by inflation rather than taxes. And that was all orchestrated by the Federal Reserve System, as we've seen, as well as other wars. But it's pretty much a big Ponzi scheme in which politicians can use money in the here and the now to buy votes at the expense of the children in the future who are going to pay off that debt. But in relation to what Swishy had said earlier, I think that it's just historically inaccurate. What he was saying about the power ratio between government and private interests in the past, under things like monarchism, mercantilism, the government chose the winners and the losers. And eventually, it did have things like the British East India Trading Company, which committed absolutely atrocious things. But that's actually what our founding fathers and our originators in America, that's what they ran away from, was mercantilism and government control, where basically you had to be born into nobility, or you had to go through this long, grueling process through the guilds just to participate in the craft that you wanted to. But nowadays, again, I would say that these private interests were not allowed to have power until the Industrial Revolution, where they actually were making more than the nobles. And still, even then, the government did try to regulate the economy because they were jealous of the achievements of this previously what previously was an underclass. So again, like I would say the government needs to only operate in the realm that it was meant to fashion to, at least in America. And I just think it's completely fallacious to say that private interests are somehow going to fill a power vacuum.
That's actually an interesting point that you made earlier about the underclass, about the newly emerging middle class. Because as we know, the middle class is a very new invention, shall we say. It basically came in the wake of the Enlightenment, in the wake of the Reformation, etc., etc. How would you, in a purely anarcho-capitalist system, ensure that the existence of the middle class is secured?
Can I respond to what you said before you asked?
Well,
yes, please do.
All right.
And then after what's the question?
Yes? So this idea that so you're saying something about like when the state has the power over the economy, it gets to choose the winners and losers, and that you started criticizing monarchy. I don't really see what that has to do with it. Like the state is, I'm not gonna beat around the bush. The states haven't always been perfect. Like not every state is equal. Not every state has done a good job, but I don't think that means that taking complete power away from the state is a solution to that problem. I think that you can have states that are for the people, that are voted in by the people. You can have an empire created solely by the people. You can have that. And choosing the winners and losers is not always a bad thing. I mean, under the system you have now in America, the government is co-opted. Previously, the government didn't get to choose the winners and losers. Now the government is co-opted by private industry and global capitalists who do get to decide the winners and losers. And they decide that anything that benefits their interests becomes the winner, which means that whatever benefits the working people, the actual citizens of the United States, they don't get to win. They don't receive any benefits. Their standard of life goes down. And these
again, I think we're just like going around in circles with this. I'm essentially saying if you do not allow the government to pimp itself out to people of great wealth, then you're not going to have a problem. Pretty much right now in America, you have a gun in the room and every person is scrambling for it. It's incredibly profitable to lobby people. Right. It's incredibly profitable to lobby politicians. If I owned a business, that's the first thing that I would do, because it's far more economically efficient to do that. So I mean, again, like I think we're going around in circles on that question.
No, I'm actually in agreement on that.
Let me just cut in here. Swishy, how would you prevent lobbying, or how would you cut down on lobbying that ends up being to the detriment of the common worker, being to the detriment of middle class people?
We're completely on the same page there. I would get rid of it entirely. There shouldn't be any money in politics. Everyone gets a vote, and you vote. No one gets to influence politics with money. You shouldn't get to fund a politician's campaign. You shouldn't be able to give private donations to a politician's private fund or charity. There should be no way to get money to the person. I think the debate here is whether or not the system that he creates is going to make them find ways to infiltrate and influence, or whether you create a system in which they don't have them, like there's an outlet for the state to physically punish them for attempting that. Because if you don't punish them for attempting that, they're just going to keep trying and trying and trying.
So how would you get money out of politics? Because a campaign is very expensive. An ad costs about like $500 per second, a TV ad in a single state on a single channel. How would you get money out of politics while
I don't know
still
the best
allowing
way to
candidates to run their campaigns?
Right. I don't know how to fix the current American system, but if I was this, I don't know what transition is to get to where I want, but I know what I want is, and what I want is none of that. You don't have to run adverts. You don't have to, or in the UK, what we have is a system where the television station, like the BBC, which is funded by the government, will play an advert from the main parties. It will play a Lib Dem advert, it will play a Labour advert, it will play a Conservative advert. If you manage to gain enough votes in by-elections or previous elections, you will get a slot to advertise yourself on the channel, and it won't cost you. There's ways to go around it. You don't have to pay for everything. There can be a system of just spreading word of mouth, like it used to be done. People shouldn't have to turn on their television or look in a newspaper or drive down the road and see a big sign. Like we have the internet now. Like you can do things for free, and you can have public television outlets. You can have public broadcasting.
Okay.
I'm not necessarily for public broadcasting, but you could find. There's always a way around it. It doesn't have to be money.
Bravos?
Well, of course, we could have like charities, or we could have trusts set up, and also they could be audited by the government as well. I mean, and who has to say is it has to be limited to television and also to newspapers? I mean, right now we're living in the great technological age. Why can't we have people go online? Why can't people have spreads on social media, on YouTube, on different avenues of communication? But I don't think that you need a state-regulated media company in order to disseminate information to voters.
I agree. I'm not necessarily for that the state broadcasting company. It was just one way in which other countries get around putting money into their campaign. I would say that
you know, one thing I wanted to ask Swishy actually was like, one thing I wanted to ask about was like what historically, I mean, because we're talking a lot about international bankers and the lobbying and things like that, but what other things do you have against the free market that would require regulation, and like in the past, or what would it be that you've seen historically?
Like, what are my issues with the free market?
Besides international bankers and lobbying and things like that.
Monopolies are an issue. I can give America as an example. Like, look at the media in America, right? In the 1950s, there was like 50 big media corporations that owned all the newspapers and the radio stations and the TV stations, right? Now there's something like 7 because they just bought the smaller ones out and bought the smaller ones out and bought the smaller ones out. And now there's a small clique of, again, international capitalists who run these organizations and who have vast influence over the politics of the United States, who have vast influence over what the public think, who can make and break an actor's career, a musician's career, anyone's career. You have to do what they say. They have so much influence over the power structures, every power structure. They can destroy a company by giving it bad press. They can destroy a person's livelihood by making them lose their job. They can influence the outcome of an election. And I think this monopoly has to be controlled. I think you have to stop certain small groups of people from gathering all the power and then using it to exert influence over people to what is to their benefit. I think that if you break that power structure up, so lots of different groups with competing interests. Now, the whole point I think we would agree on is that.
So your problem is with
the good
media,
aspect,
right? Well, that's one example.
No, hold on. Sure. And I think something we both agree on is one of the best things about capitalism is competition, right? Competition creates a better system for everyone. Competition creates better products for the customer, right? And if you allow competing interests if you break it up so that competing interests control different parts, then they're going to fight against each other. You're not going to have this monopoly on media or banking or whatever industry you look at. You're going to have people duking it out, which is going to be better for the citizens. It's always better to have competition.
Yeah, I agree with the media that there should be competition, but I mean, historically in the media, especially with starting with radio, it was highly regulated because we only have a certain number of bandwidths that can be used. And if you actually try to use a bandwidth that you don't have a license for, the government will come either fine you or arrest you. That also includes to just any kind of media organization throughout history. Like, for instance, in 1996, there was a Telecommunications Act. And in that, it said, well, before it said a single entity can own up to 12 stations nationwide, or they can own stations reaching up to 25% of U.S. TV households. That was for national television. For local television, I think there was a single entity can only own one station in a market. Then on national radio can own up to 20 FM and 20 AM stations. On local radio, a single entity could not own, operate, or control more than 2 AM and 2 FM stations in a market, and an audience shared of co-owned stations cannot exceed 25%. In the beginning, even in the advent of radio and telecommunication systems, for instance, in Europe, it was actually completely owned by the government, and they are the one who disseminated licenses and which bandwidths could be used. So in the beginning, regulation was keeping certain businesses from competing. And not only that, they also, for instance, on television, they implemented, I think it was called the FinSys system, where basically you cannot use your own programming. You cannot manufacture your own programming as a station. You had to use somebody else's programming. And they said this was going to be used to increase competition. But in the end, what actually happened is a lot of these businesses lost a lot of money, and new businesses coming into the market couldn't handle it because the original creators of the programs were to get a share of the income made from it. And
Okay,
so these people lost millions. But it's just an example. I'm just telling you this because
so these anti-monopolizations, how did this stop
finish.
competition?
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, from the beginning, they were creating these barriers of entry for people, and it escalated over history, of course. Like, now we had the Big Five, which was I think it includes Disney, Viacom, News Corporation, and I don't know the other two. But in Washington, yeah, definitely, they're powerful lobbyists. Just to achieve laws and regulations that increase their collective power. In 2000, they spent $25 million lobbying on communication issues, and they used 24 of their own lobbyists plus 4 independent lobbying firms. As far as I know, they made 64% of their campaign contributions to Republicans and 36% to Democrats. It's a really scummy thing. I agree with you, but I'm telling you that the problem is the government is regulating these industries from the beginning, and they are creating these barriers to entry, which allow these already existing companies to not only adapt to the laws already in place, but also to benefit from them because they know the systems.
All right. Okay. That was all right. Try make smaller points rather than big long paragraphs.
Yes,
it's kind of hard to address.
Sure.
But I'll try and break that down one by one as I can. Right? One of the first things you said is that they implemented certain monopoly laws, like you can only have control over 25% of what comes on American households or something like that, or you can only
the U.S. TV household.
Right. And then you said that that's decreased competition. How does that decrease competition?
Oh, you're asking about, for instance, on national television, I said they can only up to 12 stations nationwide, or
Yes.
stations can only reach up to 25% of U.S. TV households.
You gave a whole long list of monopoly laws. How does that decrease competition? That's the assertion you made.
Yeah, well, actually, within that framework, those companies, companies that were being introduced to the market, since they had this cap, ones that were more competitive could not expand their base. And also, this is actually kind of a twofold problem. Also, when they instituted new rules, there became no limit on number of stations. Then stations increased to 35% of households. At first, you had to, and of course, you also have to have the licensing. These rules make it so that you have to pay enormous amounts of money just to get on national television, local television, national radio, or local radio. Local radio, not so much. It's easier to get a radio station.
Right, these are different subjects.
But you get what I mean.
A little bit. But what about those monopoly laws? Decreased competition. There's licensing fees. There's other things. But what about those monopoly laws? Decreased competition. There's shit that happened after this law.
They decreased competition because they limited the amount of people that could get into those fields with licensing. So if these companies already have the license for this number of bandwidth, say, like I said, 12 stations nationwide, or 25% of US TV households, these people, they already have the licensing for these specified bandwidths or channels, if you will. And that means that nobody else can infringe, nobody else can outcompete them in the way like you would normally, like a grocery store or something like that. These markets are already sealed off to incoming competition. What was actually good is that the rules did change and opened it up to no limits on number of TV stations.
So what you're saying is the monopoly laws didn't have anything to do with competition. It's the constraints of the technology.
Well, yeah, like I said from the beginning, it was regulation, it was licensing that drives competition out of the market.
Okay. All right, I'll stop driving in on that point, because I don't think you're saying the monopoly laws is what decreased competition. So what specifically the licensing fees, the limit on what companies could come in. Well, what were the laws specifically?
Well, you also have to understand that with these different channels, there's only a certain number of channels that you can use. The airwaves, the different mediums of communication, they're not actually something that you can get more of. It's a limited resource. And so by not making and by making it so that people can't attain these resources, if you will, you're driving out people. I mean, it's a set limit of number of people that can use them. So if you're not making it merit-based, then it's just how much pool you have and who gets there first, if that makes any sense.
Okay, that's why actually that's the constraints of the technology. Like it's really nothing you can do about that.
There's nothing you can do about it, but the way in which they allocate resources, the government does, is through licensing, but it's not merit-based.
So what would you prefer they do? Whoever builds the biggest radio tower, who can like overhaul, like who can like drown out the signals of the smaller companies, like they should get control of frequency 5.0 or whatever, like 5.4 hertz, like they should, because they have the bigger tower, they should get control of that frequency. Like what are you advocating for exactly? What process would you like to see of how to divvy up these frequencies?
No, I would actually like to see that. I would like to see direct competition on that level.
Seriously? That's ridiculous.
Yes. I don't understand why.
Okay, so I can just build a big tower and a big radio tower, and because my tower is bigger than your tower, your radio frequency now belongs to me.
Sure, but you also have to remember that there are small producers which are able to use different kinds of frequency. What they're called today is called I think they're called pirate radio or something like that. But it's basically people that buy small. It's easy to set up. They have small radio stations and they're able to broadcast from there. So how it would work, theoretically, again, is that whatever producer had the most alluring content, whichever person had the best content, not only that, but let's say that these people are able to build these huge towers, if you will, but it wouldn't be so much as who is the person that is broadcasting the content, but what programming is making it to the is making it
right.
as part of the content. So
Okay.
there'd be a huge market that opens up just for the kind of programming that is issued.
Right. So what you're saying is, first you said there's a limited number of bandwidths, of frequencies that these people could use, and therefore there was an actual physical limit. And now you're saying, oh, any pirate radio station can just pop up and they can do what they want, and there's
right. But
so
you see, my contention. Right, but you see, my contention is that the government is able to play favorites, and it introduces lobbying. What you were so, well, I wouldn't say terrified, but you were concerned about is that these people are lobbying. They're lobbying government, and they're trying to get their way, passing policies for increased control. What I'm saying is that you can have multiple different radio stations. They certainly, they certainly would not be restricted to just one big monolith. It would be restricted to many different radio stations, because if you do try to show your programming on another person's station, of course there's going to be interference. So in that way, there would have to be some kind of voluntary setup, and outside of government bounds.
I want to try to get to the bottom of what you actually seem to have a problem with, because first you said monopoly laws, and then it wasn't that. Then it was the constraints of the technology, and it's not that. So now you're saying the government playing favorites. What do you mean by that? What is it specifically that you have an issue with when it comes to the government playing favorites?
I think I've been very clear about what I've had problems with from the beginning. I said that if you allow the governments to choose favorites, because the government is the one who has the monopoly on force and who can implement policies, and then from there can make the quality of the average citizen's life worse. That's what I want to restrict.
Specifically, how did they play favorites? That's what I'm asking.
By licensing, by allowing these companies to grow in power, by adapting to the system, by having these top 5 corporations having to lobby for these specific laws.
Okay, so licensing. You have an issue
because
having a license to broadcast.
I think we're rehashing like old, like what I've said before.
I don't think so. I've only just understood what it is you're trying to say. So if licensing is the issue here, do you think that we should scrap the licensing system? Do you think we should scrap the licensing system?
I think as of now, we have way too many licensing laws in America. About a third of all jobs require a license. Specifically, maybe there can be some cases.
Specifically to radio.
No, I would like to see radio broadcasting, television channels. I would like to see them have to compete against each other and work in a voluntary way in order to have their programming shown. Sure. I do not like to see licensing.
Great. Okay, great. I got an answer. Okay, so if we don't have any licensing, then you're going to have an overcrowded, there is a limited number of frequencies, like you said. So every one of those frequencies will end up being used by somebody. And then in that situation, what you're going to have is whoever has the biggest radio tower is going to be the one who gets to dominate that frequency. That's just the end result of that. And I don't think that whoever has the most money should be able to be the one who crowds out everyone else, and no one else gets to actually have any influence over that market. Because what will happen is an international capitalist will come in, build the biggest radio tower, and have complete dominance over the radio broadcasts. Whereas if you license it out to different groups, you break up that power structure. It doesn't just go to whoever has the most money, because then we know who it goes to. If you break that up into different groups of people who have competing interests through licensing, you can make sure that no one group has dominance over this whole system.
Yeah, I'm not sure you actually know for certain that's how it would work. I mean, for instance, we have, in the software industry, we have voluntary exchanges happening all the time. We have telecommunications companies that are working voluntarily all the time. Why would any company, why in the free market would there be one big monolith tower that would broadcast to everybody, and that was it for the end of all time? That, that seems a little bit too, again, like it seems like a quick answer. I say that if you look at all the different precedents in history, I mean, every single big market that's ever existed in the free market outside of government regulation has not turned into a monopoly. It has been broken up. Even Standard Oil was was reduced to about 90% market share and was falling by the time that antitrust laws were being enacted.
Okay, so I'll explain what I mean by that. I don't mean one.
I have to see patterns in history. That's the thing. I mean, so you can say it, but...
Well, we can give examples from other sectors and fields. So let's say you have competition, right? You're these group of people. You have competition. Let's say you have a company. Let's just call it ABC, right? I know there's already a company called ABC. Let's just call it ABC. They're sending out radio broadcasts from, City 1, City 2, and City 3. You just have to build a radio tower that's bigger than theirs in City 1, 2, and 3, produce the signal from your radio show at the same frequency, and they're gone. They don't exist anymore.
Yeah, I think you also have to take into account the amount of money it would take to keep that up for long periods of time. Eventually, somebody's going to be able to build a radio station that's just as big as yours. And also you could say smaller radio towers, or like I mean, I don't know the intricacies of the technology, but I would say that you would also have other small scale people producing content, and they would eventually grow an audience, right? They would eventually grow a base of people that watch theirs. And I mean, that's just only on top of what I said before, that you could have, people building structures that are on par. But in order to maintain that, in order to maintain a monopoly like that, you would have to, pay your workers, pay the electricity for a long period of time. It's not something that is sustainable in the market. It never has been. Nobody's been able to dominate that market that long.
So I know the time's up, but since Bravo started with the first speaker, I'm just going to respond to that and be the end. Since what you're saying is okay, since these you're saying this is unmanageable monetarily, the people I'm talking about, they don't have a limit. There's no monetary limit when they control all these other industries already, when they influence the government so much already. And if you have these smaller organizations, these smaller upstart radio broadcasters that become popular, as soon as they get to a certain level of popularity, boom, you build a radio tower. And the initial company that you tried to crowd out with your first radio tower, they've already gone out of business. So you can redirect those radio towers to that frequency. It doesn't take an immense amount of constantly building new radio towers. That's all I'll say.
All right. So after the Reformation, after the invention of movable type, literacy rates slowly shot up. Slowly, people essentially came out of intellectual hiding. The Dark Ages basically slowly transitioned into the Renaissance. Gradually, knowledge essentially became a commodity. Knowledge became something that was widespread.
Can you repeat that? I can't understand what you're saying. Yeah, I can't understand what you're saying. Could you repeat that?
Can you see it? Can I say it now? All right. So during the Renaissance, knowledge gradually became a commodity. Gradually, people once again discovered things once again. Essentially, literacy rates got into the double digits. Gradually, people started to really read both for pleasure and for spiritual purposes. Gradually, schools became something that someone of modest to high wealth could afford, and essentially thus knowledge got into the wider population. As a result, you essentially chance upon more and more people who had the potential to think great thoughts, to make great inventions, to make great discoveries. Meaning that as a whole, civilization became more intelligent. And with civilization becoming more intelligent, civilization advanced exponentially. So my question is to you, brothers, first, and then to Swishy. How would, in your system, schooling be financed? How long would schooling be financed? And how would you maintain the integrity of schooling? how would you ensure that, on one hand, schooling is available for those who require it and for as many people as possible? And two, how would you make schooling affordable in a way that does not drain the state's resources? So, Bravos, you have 5 minutes. Please start.
Okay, so I think one historical example would be they used to have schools where the teachers would teach the older students, and the older students would teach the younger students. And it was it was a free market, private schooling system. And in those days, I think it was the early 20th century, almost everybody was literate. Even the mountain men were literate, and it only costed a fraction of what a family would make in a month, I believe. Now, as far as children getting schooling and it being sustained, I would not make that a state endeavor. Never, not ever in my life, because the state, as we've seen in America and also in other Western countries, is used as a tool in order to indoctrinate your children in propaganda, statist propaganda, and I would definitely make it a voluntary matter. State teachers, they are not incentivized to be the best they can. They're not incentivized to give a quality and a good education to their students. It's actually incredibly hard to get a teacher fired, especially with the unions and all these different government sanctions. I would make sure that, well, in my society, if I had to have an ideal society, that schooling would be a private endeavor, so that teachers are routinely required to do their best, because parents would vote with their dollars. If a school was performing well, then they would send the children to that school and pay the fees. But in a system where you didn't have to compete with public services as in the past, schooling was incredibly cheap and it was very efficient.
Okay, I think there's a couple of problems I see with that. The first one is you see this the children being fed propaganda in schools, the main issue of the state. I think that's true, but I think children are always going to be fed propaganda in school. It's a matter of what propaganda you feed them. I think in a private system, all you're going to have is, yes, parents will send their kids to the school that's getting the best grades, but what are they learning in their social studies classes? What are they learning in their politics classes? What are they learning in their ethics classes? These aren't affecting their grades, but they're certainly being indoctrinated. And what you're saying is give control over the indoctrination from the state to the private industry. And that is like the fundamental difference in every single topic we've talked about. Is you say the state is going to abuse its power, and therefore we should take the power off the state and give it to the private industry. And I'm saying that the private industry is going to abuse its power, and okay, that you should not give up on the state.
Let him finish.
Yeah, I just fundamentally don't see how, when the customers are the ones that are dictating to the school what is going to happen or what kind of curriculum is going to be there. Also, parents can audit the school. They can check what kind of curriculum is going on. Private schools will have to show parents exactly what kind of curriculum they are teaching, and not only that, but we can look at the grades and at the outcomes of just private schools in America today.
All right. The way I would address that is that you're right. Parents will put their kids in whatever school gives out the best grades because they want their kid to succeed in life. And most parents will try and teach their kid social stuff at home and focus on school being where they get grades because they want to succeed economically in the future. So they will pick the school that has the best grades. You're right. You're absolutely right. The problem is when these group of people have so much money already, they have so much wealth, they will be able to buy the best teachers. They will be able to have the best school utilities, and they will create the best schools. And you will achieve excellent grades in these schools. But the problem is, what are you learning in social studies? What are you learning in ethics? What are you learning in politics? These are the issues. Now, what you're saying is, well, if you have a set curriculum from the state, you're going to have these issues. Well, not necessarily. If you have a set curriculum from the state, and the state is not run by capitalists who've infected the state, who influence the state with money and politics, then you will have a state that is put in place by the people for the people, and they will choose the curriculum that is best for the people, rather than having a curriculum that is influenced by private industry, which is the way it is already. But what you're saying is the current system doesn't work, so let's take it and give it to the private industry anyway. Just give all the power to them. And you're saying that the free market, like voting with your dollars, is going to fix this. No, because they're going to run the best schools.
Yeah, I just think that everything you say is not really based on any kind of historical accuracy. Every single institution of private schooling, when it has not had to compete with government interest to a large extent, like for instance in Britain during the World Wars, like boarding schools highly propagandized, teaching men and boys or inculcating them with very like patriotic, sacrificial dogmas. And also, I don't understand this concern about the private market when because you keep on bringing up like social studies or history or economics, et cetera, and you keep on referencing you would send your children to schools that have the best grades. I don't understand how this becomes a problem where some private company is able to monopolize the children's brains when the parents, all they have to do is take their kids out and choose another school if they start to do this or start to teach things that the parents don't agree with. They can take them out and put them into another school. As soon as the schools do something that the parents don't agree with, they can put them into another one. But it's not the same with government mandated education. As a parent, you cannot dictate to a school in any way or teachers in any way. Well, you can to some extent, but the core curriculum you cannot change. You have no power to change it on a state level. So I don't get the concern when with the state there's such a huge difference in the ratio of power.
Okay, without regulations and monopoly, what's to stop them buying out the other schools? Without some kind of regulatory body, how do you stop? You're saying that the parents will take their kids out of the school. If they have the best school, why would they take their kids out? Why would they want to put their kids? Jesus, Winter, please mute your mic when you're not. Yeah, Winter, mute your mic when you're not talking. If these, you're saying they're going to pull their kids out, right? I don't think most people will do that. I think you're assuming that most people are as ideologically understanding as you and I. I don't think that would happen. I think most people purely care about grades, and that is the end result, and that's the only end result they care about when it comes to schooling their children, is what grades are they going to get. And the private school industry is an example of this. People shop around for private schools in the UK, even though we have a public school system. If you make enough money, you shop around for a good private school. And you look for what private school produces the best pass rates for subjects. So if you own the best schools, and owning the best schools is reliant on having the most money, which they do, they are going to have the monopoly on where people want to send their kids. Now, there might be an ideological subset of society that's like 5 or 10% that care more about the ethics of their child and the morality of what they think than their economic success in the future. But this is a minority of our population. Most people don't think that deeply. Most people don't understand that. You can't rely on people being as understanding of like global politics and morality and what's good for the nation. I think you more have to rely on. You're saying like a state is going to have this system where you can't affect the curriculum, and that is a good thing in my opinion. But you can affect the curriculum by voting. Yeah, you vote for a government. You vote for a party that's going to enact that curriculum and the values and the ethics that you support. So if there's a party that ideologically aligns with you, you vote for that party, and that party will change the curriculum. You're just saying that you can't have any influence.
Can I respond to that really quickly? So you're saying that only a minority of people really care what their children are learning as far as morality or other subjects, like you mentioned. The parents are paying for this service, and maybe the top elites are looking for the best grades, but you also have to understand, like right now, we're in a system where most people do go to public school, and they do not go to private institutions. Private institutions are catering to a very select group, and if you're going to make this into a public thing where private institutions are going to be teaching people at large, of course, parents are going to audit these people. They're going to take a walk. They're going to take a tour. They're going to look at the different teachers. They're going to look at their past, look at what they've been doing for like the past 10 years of their academic career, all kinds of things. And also companies would compete with each other. It wouldn't be like, this one international banker comes in, sets up a school, and then starts to brainwash his students into acting like, I don't know, worker drones or something. Right now, like even private institutions compete with one another. Can you just imagine what it will be like if there is no state-enforced schooling? And also on that side note, what if somebody votes for a curriculum that, as a parent, you do not find to be worthy of your child, something that you wouldn't like your child to be taught? You are forced by the government to send your children to these state schools.
Okay.
So again, I don't see any kind of historical precedence or any kind of there's actually no evidence for this in the market.
I'll give you evidence. The UK is evidence. Okay, you're saying that you're forced to send your kid to public school. You're not. You can send your kid to private school. Secondly, you said that you don't shop around in public schools. Like there's you don't have a precedent for public schools where people shop around. People shop around for grades in public schools. If you look at the catchment area for, let's say, one school in my area, and then look in another area, what's the pass rate in that school, and what's the catchment area for it, you'll think, okay, this particular school has a higher pass rate than this particular school, so I'm going to buy a house in this area so that I fit into the catchment area of the school so that I can send my kid to this school. Some people will do this in private schools. They'll look at private schools and say, right, which has the best pass rate, and they'll send their kid to that school. So you're saying there's no precedent for it. There's a precedent for it in the UK. You're saying that you're making all these statements that there's no evidence for it. Everything I said happens in the UK.
I said specifically that state schools are competing with private schools, and that you also made, I don't know if you meant to say this, but you also said you're not forced to send your kids to school. You can send them to private schools. Either way, going to school is mandatory by the state. But most people don't have the money to send their children to a private school, so they have to opt for sending them to what are essentially state-run daycares.
Right. What you're saying is that if a party comes in that you don't agree with and they enforce a curriculum, that you have no other choice than to send your kid to that school. That's not true. You can send your kid to a private school. If you can't afford private school, then how are you going to afford a school system you have to pay for in the first place? The only option you're going to have...
Again, like I told you, there is a direct competition.
Hold on. If your only option, right, if you don't have any money and the system is a privatized system where it's the survival of the fittest, then you're going to have to send your kid to the shittest school because you don't have any money. Okay, how is that better than public school? How is that system better?
I already gave you a historical precedent, and I've explained why that wouldn't be a concern.
For per people.
In the past, we had when we did not have state mandated schooling, and we didn't have the state competing with private interests, where basically you have to make them expensive because you're catering to a certain group, right? But in the past, we had private schools that you would pay for. And they had in order to be competitive, they would teach the older students, and older students would teach the younger students. And this only cost like a fraction. Say, I'm not sure the exact amount, but it was incredibly low. It did not cost the family much of anything. And these people were not wealthy. These were ordinary middle-class people in the early 20th century.
That's not evidence. You need to give me statistics.
Sure it is. Why not?
Because you're not telling me how much the price was. You're not telling me what the rate of inflation was. You're not telling me what schools. If you're the poorest, right, in society, that's relative, right? So whatever the cheapest school is the school that you're going to have to send your kid to because you're poor relative to that society. So if you're poor,
sure,
your only option is to send your kid to the cheapest school, right? That's going to be the shittest school. How is that any better than the choice between public school and private school. And you're saying that there's no competition in the current system. There is competition. The private schools compete against each other, if you're talking monetarily, and the public schools still compete against each other as well, if you're talking grades.
Well, maybe in the UK system they're competing for grades, but essentially the private sector and the public sector are at odds, and people are being funneled into the public sector, and only a few are actually going into the private sector. And when I pulled the example of how schooling was done in the United States before there was forced schooling, I don't know what to say. Like we've had the state-induced system for a long time now. We've all seen how that has worked out, where there's no incentive, no incentives for school.
Right. Well, the example you gave was the older students teach the younger students. There's nothing in place that stops current private schools in the UK or the US from doing that. So what do you exactly want to see change? There's nothing stopping them from doing that now. Why would that be any different?
Sure. And I wasn't seizing upon that as some kind of way in which to make schools cheaper, but I was saying there's a historical precedent for private schooling being cheap and affordable for everyone at large.
You literally said the fact that they did that made it a fraction of the price. I'm assuming you meant because they don't have to hire as many teachers. So you're backtracking.
No, I'm not. I'm saying for that specific instance, it made it more efficient. But if you do have companies that are competing against each other like they did back then, it is going to be more cheaper. But I said that was for the public at large. If you were poor, even if you were middle class, you could send your students to that. But that would be an option. But now let's say look at just somebody who is upper middle class, or rich. Of course, they could send their students to their children to a higher quality school. But all I'm saying is that there is a precedent in American history for completely private schooling systems.
And there's a precedent. Right. But that precedent is still, that example that you're giving, we still have this system where they are available if they want to. The private industry, which competes with all the other schools, is able to, if it wants to, have the older students teach the younger students in order to decrease the potential price of what it is. And in the free market, that should be happening, right? Under your system, that should be happening so that these prices of the skills get lowered and people can do it. Why is that not happening? Why is that not happening?
No, at this point, I don't know
change?
I don't know the system in the UK. I'd have to do some research on it. But what I'm telling you is I'm not going to agree with you that somehow the private industry is going to somehow outpace the public industry when it gets so much money and funding and where it has no incentive to change at all. I can't agree with that unless. Sorry?
You saying the public gets funding or the private gets funding?
The public gets funding. It gets subsidized enormously.
Okay, so forget about you don't know anything about the UK. Use the US as an example. Why are US private schools not lowering their prices, right, by having the older students teach, right? And why would that change under your system? Why would that change? If it's not happening now, why would they start doing it under a different system?
Okay, so you're pretty much saying why don't private companies right now, today, implement this system, and then in my system, why wouldn't they do it?
Yeah, like why are they not outcompeting each other right now? How would that change under your system? How would they start doing that to outcompete each other? If they could do it to outcompete each other right now and they're still not, it sounds like they did it out of necessity, not in order to reduce prices. They probably did it, I'm assuming, because there wasn't enough teachers. And not for monetary reasons. Otherwise, if it was for monetary reasons, they'd be doing it under the current system to outcompete their competitors.
No, back in the past, there were definitely boarding schools. There were in the cities, for instance, they all competed with each other. Yes, that system was for the poor, was for the lower middle class. But your question is right now, why aren't the private schools instituting this policy? I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it. Maybe there are
the question
certain
is why
policies.
Why would it change? Why would it change under your system? That's my question.
Why would what change specific? What are you specifically asking? Can you be more specific?
Okay. They're not using the older students to teach the younger students, therefore decreasing the prices of the school under this system. Why would that change making the prices cheaper under your free market system?
Well, as of now, they're competing. I don't know. I've already answered this. Right now they're competing with state-induced. Basically, the state has a monopoly over education, and children are pushed into going into state education. Right now, for public schools to try to compete with an already established system where people are going in and out of public schools, simply would not be economically efficient. It wouldn't benefit them in any way. And of course, right now, private institutions are catering to those who have more money, and to start implementing policies for poorer students is going to make them lose their client base.
Okay.
Why would you, as a rich person, why would you send your children to a place that's formatted for poor kids?
Right. You've not answered the question. And I'll say if these companies, right, these businesses, these schools that are catering, I'll agree they're catering to the middle class and the upper class right now. How does it make them poorer? How does it make them focused on the poorer people if they have the older students teaching the younger students? How does that make them focus on the poorer people? Why as a rich person, if you saw a school that produced A results and a school that produced also A results, and one was cheaper than the other, why would you send them to the more expensive one? Do you really think that it's just about bragging rights? Like, I sent my kid to the most expensive school? I don't think so. I think these people are mostly sensible. I imagine there's probably a 1% of the elite who want their kids to go to the best of the best of the best schools as far as name goes and bragging rights. But I think the majority of people who are rich got rich by being frugal. And I think that they would send their kids to the most economically viable school. And I think that if this system that you're speaking of did reduce prices while keeping the grades at the same level, like you suggested, then there would be schools doing it currently. And there would be plenty of demand for parents who want to send their kids to the school that produces the same results as the other schools, but is slightly cheaper. Or actually quite considerably cheaper, as you explained.
Yeah, again, I don't know why a private school would implement this policy when it already has a default policy. I mean, maybe if things have been allowed to continue to go to the private route, maybe that would be a standard. I don't know. But compared to state policies and then the private policies, right now, kids sending their schools to those private institutions, they already have certain. Well, I'll put it this way. State institutions are getting so many freaking subsidies that it makes it incredibly cheap it's practically free for kids to go to school. While the private institutions do not receive these subsidies, they're not able to compete. They're not able to compete in an efficient manner like the public system is. If the public system is receiving all of this aid, basically all this free money it's not free money, but from taxpayers, and is not open to any kind of competition, why would private schools who have to pay their own way suddenly cater to the poor?
Okay,
I don't understand.
Okay, they're not catering to the poor by reducing their prices in a sensible manner. If you're producing better results than the public schools, you're still catering to the upper class. What do you not understand about that?
No, sure. I agree with you that if they can implement a better system, then they should, and if their clients can afford it. If that is the system that makes it cheaper, and they apply it, sure, that would be great too. I do not know the intricacies of the private school system as it is standing right now. I don't know what kind of regulations they have to deal with. I don't know about the biases of the people that are sending them to the school. But what I am telling you is that in the past there was a precedent for children to be sent to these schools, and they were specifically for the poor and the lower middle class. And during this system, everybody was literate, and the amount of material that they were consuming and also the magnitude of its complexity was pretty high as well. And even the mountain men could read.
Right. Well, you said it happened. You didn't give an example. And right, what you're saying is this system existed before, right? I don't agree with your statement that it happened for the certain set of reasons. I disagree with it. That's why I'm saying look at the disparity between why did that happen then? Why is it not happening now? Because I'm trying to highlight the fact that I don't agree with your conclusion about it. That I don't think that that's exactly the reason why. I think it probably had
sure.
more to do with a lack of teachers. That's why I'm highlighting it. I don't think you're catering to poor people by reducing your prices if the end result of the grades and the quality of teaching is the same. You're not catering to poor people. It doesn't make any sense. If I have a gold bar and this guy over here is selling it for $300 and this guy over here is selling the same gold bar for $200, this guy is not catering to poor people. They're both catering to rich people. One guy is giving you a better deal.
Sure, and again, I do not know what is keeping private institutions from doing that or making it cheaper. If that is a system that works well, sure, that could be implemented. But again, I'm not just focusing only on that policy that was used in the past, but also you had different boarding schools in the Americas that were private institutions before the state mandated that children go to school. There were different institutions that were competitive. I have not. This was the specific example I was giving you for the poor. Again, I don't know. I don't know how many times I have to say this. I don't know specifically why private institutions would not implement this.
Okay.
All right.
Fair enough.
In 2013, railroads account for roughly £7 billion of capital generated. In your system, how would you handle railroads? How would you handle this hardwired kind of infrastructure that essentially transforms barren places, very remote places that had no relevance prior to the establishment of the railroad? How would you handle the financing and maintenance of such infrastructure? Would you see this as something that can in any kind of way be handled privately? Or would you say the state should have 100% control of it? Or would you say maybe it can be private, but it's owned by a kind of holding company? Swishy, you start. You have 3 minutes.
Right, I see this as vital infrastructure for the country, and I think that it should be publicly owned and paid for by social dividends, like I was suggesting earlier, how Norway makes an incredible amount of money by owning the oil company and owning the oil output of its country. If you have social dividends through publicly owned profitable businesses, then you can have a publicly owned railway system. And if, in my opinion, it's just too important. It's too important to leave to the free market. It's a vital infrastructure. Now, as far as leaving it to the private industry, that's gonna, in my opinion, you could probably create a system where that worked, but it's a lot easier to keep it public. And you're gonna have a system where you have to have a bunch of people who are put in place to decide whether the public planning is okay, whether you can give them this piece of land to build over, whether or not they have the legal right to tell a homeowner to move out of his house or to give part of his farmland up because somebody has to build a railway there. You're going to have prices that are controlled by private companies, and yes, there's going to be competition, but if someone really needs to get somewhere, then they don't have an option if that's the only railroad there. This is why I think there's a lot of reasons, and to me, it's just too important to leave to the private sector.
All right, Bravos.
Yeah, I would say that in America, initially railroads were financed in part by the government, and that is where they originated from. But over time, there were acts that were passed to deregulate the system, and also there are many competing companies in this business that were resulting in lower freight rates and better deals to move their product to different states. What has been shown in the past in American history is that when the government did try to regulate the businesses or take control of it, or any kind of state ownership was implemented, the efficiency of the railroads was not, I wouldn't say terrible, but it was nowhere near the amount of productivity that the free market was able to generate.
All right. And do you want to respond to that, Swishy?
I was sending you a private message there. I just caught the start of it. Could you would you be able to repeat it, Bravo? It's just the last part.
Yeah, sure. I'm basically saying when railroads were implemented, for instance, during the Gilded Age, the railroads did start. I mean, the American government did participate in the creation of the railroad system, but it was mostly taken in hand by industrialists, and they were competing railroad systems. In 1960, I believe they started to deregulate the railroad significantly, and that resulted in an increase efficiency. Goods were able to move faster, things were more efficient, and the country and all became way more wealthier. But in the beginning, yes, there were different companies that were competing against each other very fiercely, and that resulted in the best companies producing the best products.
Right. I mean, that was back in the days when people said the United States are instead of the United States is. So, like, yeah, you're gonna have competing interest groups. You're gonna have different states with different rules. And I personally, when I'm talking about like a solid country that has actual defined laws and stuff, not a split up group of states. So when it comes to one country, I would say the country should have complete control over its borders, and because of that, they should have complete control over important public infrastructure. And to me, railroads are as important as airports and ports in general.
All right. Final question. We are going to stop in roughly 11 minutes. How do you feel about, this is a very current question, shall we say. How do you feel about public or private ownership of internet infrastructure? Especially in this case, cabling, because cabling is something that tends to be very expensive. Like 500 meters cost, like, I think $200,000, something around this range. How do you feel about public or private ownership of telecommunications infrastructure? How would you handle that in your system? Bravos, you start first.
Well, in America, telecommunications has at times been seized by the United States government. Seized is a pretty strong word, but it has been, they become the stewards of certain telecommunications assets. For instance, AT&T during World War I, the United States government became a steward of their assets. And then in World War II, AT&T also assisted them as well. But by and large, telecommunications have been definitely free market in the United States, and it is due to competition that we have the data rates that we have today, and also why it is relatively cheaper than it would be if it was governed by the government.
I pretty much agree. I don't feel the need for internet cables to be a public owned utility. I think that it should be private. I think it should be regulated like every other market, which is it's kind of a debate we've already had with other infrastructures. I think that it should be up for competition.
Fair enough.
Can I interject?
Yes, please.
I personally believe that it should be government owned, because I view it as a vital infrastructure. Essentially, I view it as Swishy views railroads. Since majority of financial transactions are made using these data lines, it should be secured under the government's stewardship, so to say.
Yeah, I can see there being a good argument for that when you take into account the financial aspect. I think what we're in is a transition stage between the internet not being a severely important public utility towards becoming a severely important public utility.
Yes.
I'm not sure if we're there yet.
Not only that, it actually strengthens competition because you have an equal playing field. For example, look at what Sweden did with its fiber optic network. Essentially, the government lays all cables. The service providers, so the ISPs, pay to use the existing infrastructure, which means that you have a higher per capita ISP rate in Sweden than you do, for example, in the US. It's the same in Israel, by the way.
Yeah, that's actually also the case in Australia, where they had the National Broadcasting Network or National Broadcasting Plan, something like that. Essentially, the idea was to create glass fiber networks from, like, literally from base to base, from the server center to the house. And essentially, everyone was going to essentially rent out bandwidth on that system and then resell it to the end consumer, meaning that there was a base price, lowest price point, and the resellers were essentially designing their prices around that. Of course, that was sabotage, blah blah blah, but it basically catapulted Australia from being one of the worst first world countries to being among the top 15. So that's something that can be considered. We are now going to have audience questions. Please ping me if you have something to say. I'm going to unmute you. And please just, if you have a question, first say whom you are going to address the question to, or if you're going to address the question to both of the debatees, so you can just kind of have a little bit of balance in the entire debate. Is there anyone here that wants to ask Bravos or Swishy something, or do we have, or are going to close up right now? Whee!
Apparently, private school does get public funding.
Yes, indeed. That's actually what the current Minister of Education is doing through the school watchers, where essentially you get units of public fund through the watcher system to private schools, which is in theory not that bad of an idea because it makes the entire thing more flexible, but at the same time, personally, I see it as a bit of a tricky kind of thing because, you know.
Mac, that's an interesting question.
First.
Mac says, what's better, public schools or private? It's addressed to both me and Bravos. It depends. I think there's an element. It depends what you want from school, really. It all comes down to what you want to get your child. If you want purely grades, then 100% private school. But if you think that street smarts, maybe better morality or somewhat ethics, I think you could make an argument that your social skills, your street smarts, your relation to the working class and morality could be better in a public school. So I think there's an argument to be made there, and it's probably dependent on what you think is more important. Bravos, do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I know certainly what system I'd like to implement as a whole. I would not like to have any state coerced public school system. I can't really give my 2 cents in that because for a lot of the time I was homeschooled. But while I was in public school, I was very, very bored. There was a lot of kids that did not do as well, and they usually held back the class. Gifted classes were better, but as far as private, I do know personally some people that graduated from private schools, and they are well-rounded, successful people. So I would say probably I would have to look at the statistics, but just off the top of my head, I'd probably say I think private school could be better. Depends on which one you choose.
You want to unmute Brian? Let him elaborate on what he's saying here. I don't know what you mean by that, Brian. You didn't touch on the profit motive and its perverted incentive for private schools. Oh, you can't talk right now. Okay. Fair enough. You want to type it to me? What have we got here? Aesthetic Spartan says military school is the best there is from his personal experience. Classless thinks I'm fence setting. If I was talking about my children, I think I would send. I think I would homeschool my children personally.
I'm just saying, you gotta watch it. You get some splinters in your ass there.
How would private schools increase their profits? More enrollments. Their fees. Well, in a competition marketplace, I don't imagine they're going to have more enrollments because that's probably going to decrease the overall outcome of the grades. I think they'll probably go for higher fees, and there will be sort of levels as you'll have the medium range price range, which gets mediocre grades. You'll have the higher price range, which gets pretty good grades, and you'll have the extremely expensive price range, which gets the exceptional grades. So yeah, you're right. It basically means that people who have more money get better grade and a better start in life.
I would imagine it would function kind of like colleges today, minus the forced student loans. I mean, minus the states is forcing banks to give out these loans to students, but there would be something essentially like a technical college, and then something more as there's different hierarchies in the college system, and they are schools that cater to specific levels of people in different levels of the economy. So technical schools could cater to somebody that is middle class or a little bit poor, while you have your state universities, and then you have your elite universities. I don't see why private institutions, private schools couldn't function in the same way.
To address Mac's question, should private schools get funding from the government? I think yes, if they're willing to follow a certain set of guidelines that the government sets out, like to do with curriculum. But I think it's somewhat good to have a system like that in place, like Brabus mentioned earlier, that not having public funding would create a sort of success barrier as to not being able to compete with public schools on the lower price range end. But I think, yeah, it would probably be a good thing for private schools to have some form of government funding.
I have a quick question for you both. What's your opinion on the voucher system? Do you know what a voucher system is?
I've heard of it. I'm not
pretty
sure
much.
exactly what it is.
I'm not a fan of it, but because the only times that I'm aware it's been implemented were in periods of like anarcho-communism, things like that. But I don't see it as a good system. I don't see it as all like as taking into all the variables and that you need in a marketplace for a nation. country, maybe at a very, very, very small level, like local level, maybe even state level, maybe. But in general, I don't like it. I don't like voucher systems.
I'm with Brian on this one. There's no point in taking money off of the public to then give them vouchers to save money on something like this. It's just an unnecessary middleman. Like just.
I don't think you understand what a school voucher system is.
It's just. I think. Well, if I understand it correctly,
I thought you were talking about something. Okay, vouchers for schools.
If I understand it correctly, the government gives school vouchers to parents where they can use this to get money off of the school of their choice, right?
No. Essentially, it's a single-payer system for private education vis-a-vis public education. So if you decide to send your kid to a public school, the public school would get the money for the kid. If you decide to send your kid to a private school, the private school would get the money for the kid. So the government is still paying the education of this citizen, but you have a sort of freedom of mobility to send your kid to what school you see fit. So it would allow people in lower socioeconomic statuses to send their kids to private school, essentially.
Well, that's pretty much what I said, except the parents don't have like a physical voucher in their hand; they just go straight to the school. Yeah, again, I don't really see the point. You could just.
I mean, I see these kind of systems working, like in homogenous societies, like Sweden, where you basically have the same culture, same ethnicity, essentially. And there being a high degree level of trust. Also, where the welfare system or just social systems in general are universal based and not means tested. So a means tested welfare is just really pretty disastrous in the UK and America. Maybe you could advocate for that in society, like the Scandinavian countries, but I still have my doubts about their system in general. But I don't know what the effect like that would be on America. I don't know letting the government getting into that usually ends up in America just ruining everything it gets its hands on. Should college be free? No, it should not.
It should.
And I will give my reason for that. In the past.
This is all. Sorry.
Yep.
This is going to be our last question.
Okay. So in the past, if I'm correct, it was only about the top 30% of students that actually went to college, into academia, and 70% of children did not go to college after graduating from general education. So I would say that 70% of that population are better off going into the trades because a lot of them don't have the academic rigor in order to survive what it needs to be passed through in college. So I would say they're probably much better going into like an apprenticeship or learning some trade, while the top 30% should probably pursue academics.
This is from a perspective.
It's not a good idea.
That's from obviously a perspective of someone who doesn't have free college in their country. Yeah, I agree with free college because there is a barrier for entry for people who are smart enough and people who can actually succeed. You have to pass, you have to get A's in school, you have to get a certain amount of grades to be let into the more difficult classes that has to be focused on that specific topic. And if you're not able to score well in school, you can go to college, like lower degrees, or you can get an apprenticeship. There's already a funneling system in the countries where college is free for making sure people who are not able to succeed don't get in. So these resources aren't wasted. There's a system already exists. Yeah, I support the current system in the UK where college is free, university is free, but there is barriers for entry.
All right.
Well, yeah, you're talking about some sort of merit-based system still, right?
Yeah, that's the system in the UK.
Yeah, you pretty much have to earn your way into those colleges.
Yep.
Yeah, for America, I would not advocate for that at all. I think that you need to pay your way. For instance, like in the 1950s, when you went to college, you could have a side job, pay for it, and get out without any debt. That system has worked before in the past, and I think that it can be implemented again. We need to get the government to stop forcing banks to give students loans, and also this constant increase in the dishing out of loans by banks has created this artificial demand for college, and so that has also driven up the price for college very heftily. And if I had my choice, I would keep it. I would keep it back to the 1950 policy of the 1950s policy of going to school and paying your way. It's I think like the system Swishy is talking about. I don't think it is actually in the long run good for the country.
All right. So your opinion is pull yourself up from the bootstraps.
Yes.
Goddamn lazy 17 and 18-year-olds. Fucking yeah. I don't know. I feel like these people can be from different. These people can be from difficult situations. They're at a young age. They haven't really had a chance to get out in the world yet.
Don't worry, just throw bootstraps at them.
Yeah, just throw those bootstraps up and pull those up, boy.
All right, guys. All right. We are any of you going to make any kind of closing statements, any kind of summary of what you discussed, anything like that? Because we're going to close up in a couple of minutes.
I just would say there is a group of giant capitalists who own all the factories and shares and ultimately lead the people. And the only way to combat that is with the state, is with the power of the people. You can't combat that by leaving it up to those private interests because they already own the private interests. They already have control over that particular sector.
All right, Ross.
Well, I would say that, again, most of my perspective is coming from American history, and people were able to have a high standard of good quality of life. People were able to go to college. People were able to buy goods that were, compared to today's prices, were very low when we didn't have so much inflation. In all, I would say that I see one constant in this equation, and that is that the state is able to regulate. And while at first it might seem altruistic and it might bring benefit in the here and now, long term, giving government that power will always present the opportunity for the government to use that power in a way that you don't want it to. Essentially, the less power that you give to government, the less opportunities you give it to screw your system up. That's what I was saying.
Fair enough.
Kill Hydra.
Cyclops did nothing wrong, just saying. Anyways, that being said, this was our first debate in our new format between Swishy and Ross. I've been Winter, the Nascent beside your most gracious and most patient host. Thank you all for coming. I hope you learned something. I hope we all learned something. I definitely learned a lot of stuff about moderating a podcast because this was literally my first fucking time of doing this shit. Thank you for attending, and I wish you all a good night, a good afternoon, and a good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for being here.
Goodbye,
And
folks.
goodbye.